everybody. Welcome to Echoes of Injustice, Rethinking Crime, Punishment, and Justice for Indigenous Peoples. I am Dr. Dina Isom. I am an Associate Professor of African American Studies at the University of South Carolina, and I have the honor of moderating our discussion today with these wonderful panelists. So this presidential session asks us to reckon with a long and ongoing history of injustice, a history rooted in colonization, displacement, and imposed systems of law that continue to shape Indigenous experiences with crime and punishment today. Our goal is not only to identify these harms, but to elevate Indigenous visions of justice, healing, and sovereignty. I'm honored to be joined by two leading scholars whose work center the voices, experiences, and agency of Indigenous communities, Dr. Teresa Roches Berdal and Dr. Erica Redner-Vera. Dr. Sarah Deer from the University Distinguished Professor in Women, Gender Studies, and Sexuality at the School of Public Affairs and Administration is unable to join us today, but she is available through her email provided here, and her contributions will be missed, but I know we will still have an insightful and inspiring conversation with our two amazing featured panelists. So, Dr. Teresa Roches Berdal is an associate professor in the Department of Sociology at Cornell University. Dr. Berdal's work focuses on tribal sovereignty, indigenous legal systems, and the racialized structures embedded in U.S. policing and law. Her scholarship draws attention to the intersections of race, indigeneity, justice, and emphasizing sovereignty and relational accountability. Dr. Erica Redner-Vera, assistant professor at the School of Public Affairs at San Diego State University. Dr. Redner-Vera's research examines Indigenous justice and healing, focusing on culturally responsive approaches, restorative practices, and experiences of Indigenous women and youth. Her work brings criminology and community-based justice to our experiences of understanding crime. So I'm going to turn over to our panelists for opening remarks before we begin our discussion. So would you like to go first? You want to go first?
Yes. Okay. All right, let's see. Is this one on? Yes? Yes, it is. Okay, perfect. So, as you said, I'm Teresa Roches Berdal. It's an honor to be here, and I want to thank the organizers for bringing us together for this important panel. What we understand is very much an opening conversation about how we understand the relationship between Indigenous peoples, law, justice, whatever that might mean in a settler colonial context, and our responsibilities as scholars to one another and also to Indigenous issues and peoples. I went to Cornell University, but I am an associate professor of sociology at the University of Washington, so I just want to give them the credit that they deserve because they are lovely. And so as a point of, I ordinarily don't do this, but I'll do this given the nature of the panel. I sort of want to ground you in who I am and where I am and who I represent when I talk to you about this particular kind of issue. I am Oneida Sault Ste. Marie and Lance Keweenaw Bay from the Great Lakes here in the United States on my mother's side, and I'm Mexican from San Luis Potosí on my father's side. I was born in San Diego and raised between there, Tijuana, the Manzanita Kumeyaay Reservation in East San Diego County and Los Angeles, depending on, like many of us who were border kids, depending on where my family could afford to live or where their job was, that's sort of where we lived. So it was this very kind of in-transit life and childhood that I didn't realize was in transit because I watched that happen to everyone else around me when I was young. But this shapes how I think about and come to the work of both being a lawyer and a sociologist. So something else to keep in mind is throughout this time, as I'm growing up, my dad was undocumented. He didn't become documented until I went to law school and could figure out like what the hell was going on with the bureaucratic paperwork, because it was just bureaucratic paperwork. Oh, well, we lost this thing from 1987. Okay, well, are you gonna let us know what you lost so we can figure this out? And my mom was in and out of jail, mostly for buying, selling, and smoking weed with her friends. And so the California history of incarcerating, well, really the US history of incarcerating our family members for smoking weed and buying weed when you can just walk to a dispensary 2 blocks from here now, it feels a little violent in ways that I think that we haven't yet given enough credit to, especially those of us scholars who grew up in families where this was an issue. But because of all of this history, I'm also a first-generation high school graduate, and I take that responsibility very seriously in thinking about how I come to the pedagogy of this work, the work that I publish, and the way that I teach my students and hold them accountable to understand the responsibility that we have in the classroom, both as educators and learners. So I say all of that, and then want to begin more formally by saying that my family's story is not an exception. It's one small echo of a much larger pattern, which is how the United States uses borders, jails, child removal, and police power to name, refuse, and subordinate not just Indigenous peoples, but other racialized communities as well. So when my dad crossed the border with papers and then could not get them renewed, when my mom cycled in and out of jail for drug charges, or when 3 generations of my family were forced into Indian boarding schools, this was all intentional because the state was designed and designed itself to interact with us as disposable, criminal, and removable. So these experiences, of course, are deeply personal for me and probably for many of you, but they're also structural, and they sit inside longer histories of criminalization, land theft, and family separation that show how crime, punishment, and whatever we think justice is works and doesn't work for Indigenous peoples today. In recent years, much of our collective work as scholars in this room on police violence, mass incarceration, racialized state power, and so on has been gaining incredible, important traction in the field. But even so, Indigenous peoples continue to remain in the margins of the stories that we tell and the work that we do in criminology, sociology, political science, and so many other academic spaces. And this absence means that as criminologists, we hear very little about how the criminal legal system is bound up within settler colonialism, which is, of course, the theft of land, the destruction of native governance, and the effort to disappear Indigenous peoples as political communities. Why? Because settlers wanted our land, they wanted our resources, and they didn't want us here to get in the way of all of that. But we rarely name, at least in my kind of role in the way I'm situated within criminology, we rarely name these social processes. We study the criminal legal system without acknowledging first and foremost that the criminal legal system cannot exist, cannot be understood without its relationship and its emergence from settler colonialism. So I start there, and I hope we can talk more about that today during the Q&A. And I want to think about, at least this is what I do in my work, and I want to think about this with you, how law and the family policing system and policing in the United States sits at the heart of the settler colonial project. What it means to contain, to name, to refuse particular peoples so the state can take advantages of them in the way that it wants and that serves its ultimate goals. So a couple of things. I want to think about together how we wrestle with a few questions. So I'm going to pose a couple of questions for you all to consider. First, how do we rethink crime and punishment when the category of crime itself has been used to erase Indigenous presence and criminalize Indigenous survival? The second question I'm really eager to discuss with all of you is, what does justice look like when the very institutions that claim to provide safety have served as central instruments of dispossession and family separation, not for just us as Native people, but for many of your families as well? The third question is, how can tribal nations pursue safety and accountability in ways that rebuild Indigenous legal systems instead of reproducing the logics of elimination? Because this is what happens in Indian country. We have problems, we have needs. The federal government says, here are more cops, here are more jails, and also here are prisons too. And instead of us coming to police you and incarcerate you, let's hire your own tribal members to do it to yourselves. And then the last question I want us to consider together is, what would it mean for non-Native people and for the state itself to confront the carceral foundations of the United States and its sovereignty here on Indigenous lands? And what would that look like in the context of our work as criminologists, social scientists, and as people who are smart and curious about what a more just world looks like? So I will stop there and hand it over to Erica.
Thank you so much for that, and thank you to the organizers, thank you for this important work. I'm really looking forward to being on this panel and to see this work elevated in this way in this discussion. I will start by sharing also that I'm a first-generation academic, and to give a little bit of background about myself and how I came into this work. In studying criminology in undergrad, it was through the lens of my experience as a Chicana woman, and then the more education I got, realizing that Chicanos are also Indigenous people, but I'm married to a Paiute Shoshone tribal member, and those conversations became really illuminating when I was in grad school, and really wanting to dig into race and social justice issues, and realizing that we're literally saying we're not talking about Indigenous people in any capacity. And having grown up in Nevada, there are a large number of tribal members and reservations, and just not even having that conversation felt very troubling and othering, and so trying to bring those conversations into the classroom. So with that, I really want to shout out my husband, who is Paiute Shoshone, and really helping to navigate and open my worldview and understanding those conversations, and I think he's really shaped how I've understood this work and brought it into the spaces that I've been in. And so he is Paiute Shoshone. Our children are also tribal members. I also want to start by saying we have 4, and they all have Indigenous names, and that was intentional because we ground them in their indigeneity. So we share with them when people say your name, they're speaking Paiute, they're speaking Nawa, and so they have a sense of who they are in navigating the world, and that was really important to us because, as was shared, right, Indigenous peoples are often not thought about at all or forgotten about and kind of in the background, and so that was very important and intentional for us. And so how my work specifically focuses on a more broader understanding on race and justice issues and how Native people experience the criminal justice system. And so the work that I have published is in spaces of how Native people are sentenced in the federal court. I've also published some things on policing and just understanding how Native people experience the justice system. And the research is clear that they experience it disproportionately compared to other races and ethnicities, but we often get stuck in this black-white dichotomy. So to make a little bit more space about how Indigenous people experience the justice system is something that I'm really fortunate and privileged, recognize that privilege that I'm able to do and bring the conversation forward. So I'll keep my introduction brief and look forward to engaging in this conversation.
Well, thank you both for those wonderful overviews of the work that you do and your history and how you came to this space. To give us kind of a basic overview and understanding, can you give us a brief overview, background of how the criminal legal system actually works in Indian country today?
Okay, so we kind of pre-planned this. Erica and I didn't know each other prior. We only knew each other through publications. So we spent some time together trying to think about how our different expertise can contribute to creating a really good baseline in the room so everyone feels comfortable and confident with some basics of the criminal legal system in Indian country. And to bracket that, we hope that you feel comfortable when you're asking questions to not feel like you need to have the right names or the right full identities of a particular issue or topic. You don't need to be an expert to be engaged in this conversation. So especially as a reminder for folks who just walked in or walked in recently, this is a starting conversation. So for criminology to think very seriously about its responsibilities to Indigenous people, to Indian country, but also marginalized peoples more broadly in ways that the field has yet to do or has yet to bring justice to. So on that, overview of the criminal legal system. So a lot of times when someone answers this question, they say, oh, it's really complicated. There's a jurisdictional maze. There's all these people who have their hands in the pot. That is absolutely true. But if you're not really quite sure what that means, I sort of want to start from ground zero there and to understand that in Indian country, when we say there's overlapping jurisdictions, we're really talking about 3 systems, or 3 factors, but 1, 2, 3, 4, 5 systems. So the federal, the state, the county, the city, and the tribal authority. So we're always talking about these 5 jurisdictions at the same time. And the 3 kind of factors that we're thinking about is before you can even understand what any of these 5 are going to do, if you even remember that there are 5, authority depends on the first issue, which is the nature of the offense. So the particular kind of offense matters, and whether it's classified as what the federal government calls a major crime or not. Major crime being something like murder. And that matters because the federal government is always the first sovereign. As tribal people, we are the third sovereign. So the federal government is the first, the states are the second, and we are the third sovereign. So to know the major crime, whether it is or is not a major crime, is where we start. The second thing, the second factor, is we need to know exactly where the crime occurred and whether it happened on federal land. And federal land is what's defined as Indian country under the law. It's sort of a ridiculous term, but it is what the federal government calls native lands. And we also then need to know whether or not where it happened falls into what's called a public law 280 state. And we can talk about that more later, but the federal government, as you might have remembered from your K-12 education or because you're a thoughtful person, you realized that they signed a whole lot of agreements saying, we want this and we will give you that. And of course, over the years, it pulled back on all of it and said, we know we promised you this, but we're really not going to give it to you anymore. And this jurisdiction that we also promised as the first sovereign over you and your lands, we're also not quite sure we want to keep running that. So we're going to give it away to the states that want it. We're going to force some states to take it. And by the way, we're not going to give the states any money, any resources, or any capacity to be able to do that job. So good luck and goodbye, because the states would be pissed at you and pissed at us. And so when you call, no one will come. And then the third kind of big factor is whether the person who is accused of that crime is legally classified as an Indian or a non-Indian. Again, that term is not our term. That is the legal term that the federal government uses to talk to us about as Native people. So those kind of three things define what the criminal legal system look like. Nature of the offense, where it occurred, whether or not the person who is accused of the crime is an Indian person within these 5 jurisdictions, who may or may not answer your call when you call. Basic overview.
Awesome. And so how has it come to look this way? Like, what were some of the key historical turning points that led to this structure?
So I think that's me again.
So you got all the legal.
Yeah. And I'll say it too, in my legal training, I'm trained in federal Indian law. And it was really important for me to do that because when I was younger, and I was interning at the California Indian Legal Services in Oakland, which is a not-for-profit Indian law firm in California State, tribes were spending hundreds of thousands, if not millions of dollars to hire non-Native people to help them figure out really basic jurisdictional questions. I didn't know that's what I was going to do, but as soon as I started interning there, I understood very quickly, a lot of us who live through these phenomena, whatever these phenomena are, we understand them intimately in ways that other people who don't come from our communities don't understand. And personally, especially being a first-generation high school graduate, I felt it was a responsibility. I'm also the last of 13 kids, so I was the kid that my older siblings made sure got to school, had a lunch, and so I understood my role was to make sure that I could learn as much as humanly possible, not just for my family, but for the peoples that I come from. And so when I went to California Indian Legal Services, it was shocking to me that many for-profit private law firms didn't understand the answer to this basic question, which is, in 1790, again, there's no quiz, but just to kind of give you a sense, in 1790, what becomes the federal government says that there is a law they called the Indian Trade and Intercourse Act, which meant that the federal government is going to lay claims to regulate crimes. So just because it declared itself the first sovereign didn't actually mean it had any jurisdiction over Native people or Native lands. So the federal government, like most governments, they make up rules as they go along. They're like, wait a minute, we forgot to carve that out for ourselves, so we're going to do that. So in 1790, they do that. And they say then, over time, that they need to figure out particular kinds of punishing authority over those crimes. And so we're going to jump into 1817, so what is that, to almost 30 years after it declares the right to regulate crimes in Indian country. It then extends itself federal criminal jurisdiction into Indian country for crimes involving both natives and non-native people. So this idea of whether you're Indian or not, if you are individual who allegedly committed a crime matters, but so does who is on the receiving end. From 1817, we're going to launch ourselves into the reservation period. So 1817 is a really important time because the federal government is beginning and arguably well underway, mapping every inch of every mile of our lands. And they're measuring them meticulously because they need to figure out, one, how much there is, two, who it will go to, and three, at what cost, and four, then what they want to exchange with us to get us off that land. So this moves into, from 1817, it moves into what we call the pass system from Indian agents. So Indian agents are essentially, I guess what you would call a federal agent today. So they're people who really had no experience in Indian country or governance, but they had worked in some capacity in the military, or they were a friend of a friend, or they were a second cousin who needed a job, or they were the brother of the person that you wanted your sister to marry. They got the job, and they were sent out by the federal government to enact this federal policy over jurisdiction. And so these individuals, they were responsible for containing Native people as we were being moved onto reservations, making us stay there. So when there are, you may have heard this before, the pass system, if you left the reservation without a pass, you could be subject to punishment, almost always, even death. And so this 1817 move allowed the federal government to essentially hold us hostage on our own land because it gave itself criminal jurisdiction. There's a bunch of Supreme Court cases that come along that solidify that power. The Supreme Court cases matter a whole lot today, but when they were enacted beginning in the 1830s, nobody cared. Nobody cared because the Supreme Court didn't mean anything. Arguably, who knows what it means today, but it definitely didn't mean anything then, and it was operating in a basement, and the federal government didn't care for it at all. So it was passing these laws that essentially said, very quietly, nobody really paid attention except for Indian country, that said that we essentially don't have any rights to our own land, and if we don't have any rights to our own land, we don't have any rights to our own jurisdiction. And I'll stop there because it gets messier and crazier every decade after that.
And I know that that was still just a very brief overview of all the complexities in the history. And I thank you so much, Teresa, for laying out what we often don't even think about, the fact that there are multiple sovereigns, multiple factors, all these things that play into this very distinct and unique and complex lived experience that we don't highlight enough within our field. And thinking about that, obviously this impacts all Indigenous people, but even those that face intersectional identities, and particularly women and youth, which I know that Erica, you highlight in your work. And so can you think and tell us about some of the distinct experiences of victimization and criminalization faced by women and youth, and what community narratives really reveal about those experiences?
Yeah, thank you. And thank you for laying that groundwork. It's essential to understanding how Native people today experience the justice system. And so what I'll add, and then to answer your question, is that really it's just a system of control and management, that Native people have always been in the way of Western expansion and progress. And so how does the federal government grapple with managing these people that are just essentially in the way? And so it was never a system that was with their best interest in mind. And so to your point about policing the reservation and making sure that Native people stayed on the reservation, and then going away from that in any capacity was just viewed through a colonial lens and harmful to Native peoples for their survival and for thriving. And so what we see today is just the fallout of all of that. And so very much stereotypes, intersectionality play a critical role in how they experience the justice system from the federal government in particular. Native people are overwhelmingly represented in the justice system compared to other races and ethnicities in all aspects of the justice system, from police, courts, corrections, more likely to be killed by the police relative to their numbers of the population, more likely to be incarcerated, and just the harms of that is what we're seeing overwhelmingly. So where intersectionality, and I think where unfortunately Dr. Deere wasn't able to show up, Native women in particular experience the brunt of that harm in terms of the colonial fallout and the violence that Native women have experienced, is just fallout of how we're seeing that they have been managed and controlled by the federal government. So that's a basic overview of answering your question.
Yeah.
But
I appreciate it. Thank you.
Did you want to?
Would you like to?
I think that you did a great job, especially summing up the idea of essentially that our sovereignty as Native peoples was always conditional and revocable. And so long as someone's freedom, and in this instance, it's our sovereignty, is conditional and revocable, it means that there is no goalpost, there is no end of the maze, no end of the abyss. It will always change so long as the federal government has an interest in the lands and resources that we call our ancestral homes. So the criminal legal system, because it emerges from settler colonialism and these logics, will continue to over-incarcerate and to over and under-police us simultaneously in ways that are both similar and different than other marginalized and racialized groups. And it's just, I think, collectively our hope that we can begin to think about Native peoples within these systems that many of us in this room are experts about.
Thank y'all both for that. And Teresa, I appreciated that you kind of ended your introduction with these leading questions, and ironically, I had very similar questions posed for y'all as well. And so I think that is a nice transition. When you were thinking about how do we rethink crime, I was like, what does really justice mean in a decolonized context? Like, how do we get beyond our westernized colonial thinking?
Do you want to start? Go ahead.
I'll do the big frame, and then you have very particular kind of comments. So I think that it means a whole lot of things. It means, oftentimes actually when people sort of ask me this question, they expect me to say something like, so you want us all to go home, like wherever home is? Like you just want all of us non-Native people to leave? And I was like, I'm not really sure where you got that idea from, but also like, what would that look like? Like we would like our land back, and our land back doesn't mean you all must disappear as a result of that. Like that just sounds like some reverse genocide colonial BS to me and to my Native family and communities. But what it means is really taking a step back and having a very hard conversation about what do you think we are owed? What do you think our responsibilities are to one another? What do you think you deserve and why? And at what point is your hierarchical sort of understanding of the right to live negotiable? Because if it's not negotiable, you might want to leave. But if it is negotiable, which you claim that it is, if we are third sovereigns, then this requires us to have very hard conversations about who we are and who we want to be. And I don't know about you, but I'm not sure we have a really good track record in the United States of doing that. So I don't expect these things to change anytime soon, but I do think there are a lot of really important things that can happen in the interim. So in the interim, I think this means full self-determination, not just self-determination as the federal government spells it out, and not self-determination until someone is able to launch an assault on tribal sovereignty through the Supreme Court or through private corporations or by paying off A, B, and C to be able to strip our land of resources and relocate us. I think it means funding streams that are not on a contract cycle. So many programs in Indian country, overwhelmingly the majority of programs, whether it's a policing contract or it's a child welfare fund to help grandparents, Native grandparents, spend time with their grandchildren that live far away. Whatever it is, it's working on a contract system that the federal government has to keep, or the tribal governments have to keep applying for. And the federal government often changes its mind and says, well, you know, this funding that you've had for 3 years, we no longer want to pay for it, so we're going to switch it up. And so the system you built, you have to figure out how you're going to run this thing. And imagine if you're a tribe of 3,000 people, you're running an entire government and of your own, because the federal government, for the most part, does not want to offer any services to you, including the ability to call the fire department when there's a fire on your reservation. You have to subcontract with the county or the city to have somebody else or a private firefighter come out to help you. So you're 3,000 people, you're trying to deal with all of these logistics, and then the federal government says all the things that we promised you, it's on a contract annual basis. You must reapply, which means, as you might imagine, it is really hard to get anything done. And it is meant to be that way. So think about your own funding. If someone, you applied for funding and you got it and they were like, great, this is indefinite funding. And then every year they tell you, well, we've kind of changed our mind and our funding profile looks a little different, so we're not really sure we can help you. Why don't you just, if you want to figure out how to do your research, why don't you figure out how to shore up the resources on your own? You would never be able to complete the project as you thought that you had. But then they would say, but don't worry, try again next year because we might be able to help you. So you're gonna try again. And this is what happens in Indian country. So I think in addition to having these hard conversations, we need to think about that funding stream. What does it mean to actually, without the threat of the removal of those funds, what would it look like to properly honor the treaties financially? If you can't do it through land, then what does it mean to do it financially? And in what ways can we begin to use those resources to enact tribal jurisdiction as we want for ourselves? There's nearly 600 federally recognized tribes and many other who are non-recognized and also state recognized. So when I say we, I mean in 600 at minimum different ways that this would look. But we need the space, the time, and the resources to be able to do that, and that's what the federal government promised. And I think this idea of, and what I write a lot about is this idea of delegated abandonment, which is what the federal government has done, and we need to revisit this in our scholarship, in our governance, and how we think about the role of Native peoples within the field. And what I mean by that, by delegated abandonment, is this idea that the settler state built an architecture of control and coercion that continues to delegate the day-to-day functioning of life in Indian country. And it built that infrastructure and then it handed it off to us as Native people to do on our own. And so I mentioned this earlier that for the most part, the jails and prisons that have come into Indian country are staffed and run by Native people themselves. And so the federal government can say, well, we're no longer the ones who are holding you back. It seems like it's you who's doing it. And I think that beginning to say these things out loud without the threat that your funding in 3 months that's almost up will be revoked if you dare say something that the federal government is uncomfortable with, we have to have really hard conversations about what this looks like.
And to pick up there, that's what I was going to offer too. I think when you ask what does justice look like, it is a complicated, convoluted answer. There's no one particular answer, but what does come to mind is the acknowledgement and recognition of the harms that have been caused, and literally a seat at the table for Indigenous peoples to police and manage their own communities, how they best see fit, and how does that look in today's society, and also quite literally coming from the top down, the lack of acknowledgement of Indigenous Peoples Day, I think is a very clear starting point that this current administration is not interested in acknowledging Indigenous peoples in the ways that they need to be. So it's literally just recognition and acknowledgement of the harms that have been caused, and how can we amicably move forward with hearing their voices and how they want to move forward and recognizing their full sovereignty.
Thank you both for that. And building on those ideas, like, we don't see a ton of this in literature, but then when we do, we're often just talking about disparities. So how do we really move on and start interrogating settler logic and really thinking about the true lived experiences of these people that really produce those disparities?
Yeah, that's a great question. I think disparities for me, that's maybe an easy starting point, because marginalized peoples, when we talk about the justice system, are at the disproportionate end of that, so it's easy to come from a disparities perspective, and also so much of the groundwork needs to be laid because most people don't consider Indigenous issues in criminology, and so that's why there's a repetitiveness in the literature to talk about that in particular. But moving away from that, once we've laid the groundwork to step back and understand how intersectionality plays a role, how Native women in particular, how poverty plays a role, how there are high suicide rates, all of the negative factors that come along with settler colonialism that are ongoing in these communities need to be disentangled and understood in ways that are intentional. And so I think, disparities is a starting point, but moving more broadly, we can do that once we have a solid foundation and understanding, and that this is a really great starting point, having these tough conversations, but more more people at the table, more with lived experience and understanding of what's happening on the ground in these communities. Do you want to?
Yes. Also, these are questions we didn't know. So I love being able to think about it as you're talking. So I think one really important thing that many scholars already do, but I think we could do more of, is really to interrogate the architecture of violence and coercion that exists in the United States and that underpins all of our work. So this may seem a little silly or unnecessary to some people, but I think, especially as a policing scholar, my work is done both in Indian country and in large and mid-sized cities across the United States. I understand that architecture, of course, as different, but its origins and its impetus are actually one and the same. So starting from this ability to say, I may not be an expert in Indian country or of tribal law or of federal Indian law, but I do understand where the need to use violence to enact the state's aims comes from. I think saying those things out loud and problematizing our own work, how and why we ask the questions that we do, and why it would be silly to say those things. Why would it be silly to other colleagues for us to name where the origin of the violence that we study so well, the downstream of that violence? Why would it be silly to continue to remind people where that violence comes from? I think we have not just a moral responsibility, but a professional responsibility to continue to name, define, describe, and interrogate that architecture, especially for those of us who hope to see people be able to live more just lives in their own terms in society. I think that architecture really matters. But I also understand it can be mundane and boring for some people. I think it's really, really important. That's probably why I'm a lawyer. But I think that it's empowering, too, when we understand how the system works, because we're not tallying the harm without also tallying the blueprint of where that harm came from.
Ah, wonderful. And building kind of off of that idea of understanding beyond disparities, really interrogating the root and the challenges of all of this, we often know that criminology grapples with who counts, whose knowledge counts, the creators of the knowledge, who is worth focusing on, and so forth. And so how can indigenous epistemologies, ways of knowing, teaching, whatnot, challenge our dominant criminological paradigms that are often rooted in Western thought?
Do you want to start?
Sure. Because I think we're going to have really different answers. So
Okay.
I'm just guessing, though. We met today. So just guessing. But I think that, and this goes back to, of course, my training, but also how I was raised as both a Native and Mexican person, in that I understand indigenous epistemologies not as something that necessarily belongs in the academy, and not something that you will ever see me publish on, because that is a relational way of seeing the world. It's like what it would mean to advertise how you and your family and your besties, like when you're sitting around the table, you don't just publish that, and that's not for your colleagues. That is a way that you engage intimately with one another and how you move through the world as a collective in whatever way that collective makes sense to you. So tribal epistemologies, to me, I think that we need to know them and learn them. And especially as non-Native scholars, the easiest way to do that is to read tribal law. So tribal law is very different than federal Indian law. Tribal law is the epistemologies built into things like tribal codes and tribal court decisions, and those are not always accessible, but many of them are. And so a way to begin to engage Native epistemologies is by going to those laws and understanding them. I don't think that means that then I or you need to go and publish about them, but I think we have a responsibility to try to understand how different people think about justice in the world and their responsibilities to each other. So I don't know that I need to see it in anybody's work, but I do know that I also have a responsibility, and I'm sure you all do this in your own way. As an ethnographer, I sit with people for a long, long time, sometimes longer than I should or longer than I want to, I'm tired and I would really like to go home because I have to make dinner for my kids, but you sit with people for a long time and you try to understand how they see the world. And any good ethnographer is not going to publish that work unless they are pretty sure they have a sense of how these communities, these people, these individuals want themselves represented in the world, because you're in conversation with them. You're there as a scholar, and we can apply that same sort of qualitative ethnographic way of moving in the world as scholars. We can apply that in how we understand tribal epistemologies without then having to go publish it. Because there's a lot of stuff as ethnographers we'd never write about. That's not meant for the academy. It's not meant for people out there. So I think it's going to be different how we understand it, but I think it's important that we learn it, but not necessarily ever to publish on it, if that makes sense.
And I agree. I think what I'll just add too is that understanding it and living it, and then understanding that it's not for everyone, especially the academy's consumption. You exist then in a weird space where you're trying to show up authentically as yourself and exist in an institution that wasn't designed for you. And so wanting to show up authentically and Indigenous storytelling, or integrate that in the classroom in ways that isn't always well received by students who often think of Native people only in the past and don't understand that they're here and existing, and then also by colleagues who may not be supportive of that because it feels different from what the traditional ways of teaching might be like. Existing in that space means that while it's not for consumption, it's a tricky dance that you have to play in wanting to show up authentically and be all of those things without needing the validation or needing to publish in particular. But I think it then makes it even more important, right, to show up authentically and be in community with people who get it. And so introducing it in small ways that seem that are appropriate in the ways that we have to bend in the academy and show up as ourselves. I think that's what I'm hearing as I heard you respond. So it's difficult, but we're here and we're doing it, and so doing it in ways that make sense.
And I'll just quickly add, there are a lot of really fantastic readers on tribal law. Justin Richland and Sarah Deere actually have a really great collection. I think it came out maybe 25 years ago. And you can cut through, you don't have to go start looking for tribal codes on your own, but you can start there as an impetus. And I use it when I teach, and I then, as an assignment, have students go look at tribal code and ask them to consider how tribal code differs from how they understand the criminal legal system in the way they experience it. So, and they immediately find differences. One of the things, especially in my work in child welfare, that they find immediately sort of blown away by is that many tribes' definition of family, of course, is not the mother, father, children. It is not just even blood relatives. It is the people who are in community with you and care for you and will show up for you. And tribal code is built in a way, not all tribes, but many tribes, it's built in a way that understands that as people, we are fluid. Sometimes people move in and out of a family. Sometimes they need to leave for a little while and come back, and somebody else needs to step in. And that there is no abdication of the parental rights. It is a mutual rearing of young people, because we all have a responsibility to do so. And students are just like, how could this be? And it's like, well, let's look at what the epistemology is and how and why we think that way, and why these codes might be able to do that. And then they say, well, how come we don't have child welfare codes that look like that? I'm like, that's an excellent question, and we should move on to that next, because it helps us to rethink what we think the law is and what it can and should be.
I think that that's a wonderful segue into also thinking about giving these challenges, given these complexities, giving this rich and deep history. Where do you see these indigenous nations building their own approaches to understandings of justice and safety?
Yeah, I don't mind starting. As you're asking, I'm reflecting on my own experience growing up in Nevada, but also living currently in San Diego, and San Diego County has the most number of tribal reservations, and trying to connect with community and understanding what they're doing on the ground is really critical. And I think what I'm seeing is just an ownership, and they don't have to do the heavy lifting of laying the groundwork and, you know, understanding how their communities have been treated, and instead it's more community-based. It's more taking care of ourselves, and then education is a means to upward mobility and social capital. So there's a lot of education components and programs that the tribes are doing to support themselves and connecting with the university, and so there's a lot of overlap. And so while there's the harm has already been there, it's moving past the harm to understand how do we repair and move forward. So I'm seeing a lot of that, and that's where my work is moving into, and then grappling with things like historical trauma and restorative justice practices. And yeah, that's what my reflections are.
I feel like this is, I don't know about you, this is fun for me because I get to learn how other people are thinking about similar topics that I wouldn't ordinarily be in conversation with either. So thank you, Erica, for that. I'm also thinking about the role that many Native nations play in co-governance of cities and counties and states in ways that we might not always recognize. And so as Erica said, San Diego County has more federally recognized tribes in one county than any other county in the United States. And people often think like, well, it has to be Oklahoma. They think, where is Indian country? And they think somewhere else. So the ability to take responsibility for the knowledge that exists in the place where you live is never underappreciated by Native people. To know whose land you're on is not just to be able to name it, but to understand who and how co-governance works in that place or doesn't work, and then how our expertise as criminologists play a role in all of that, and then how can we be in service of communities at the same time, including tribal nations. And so I always do this, but especially now that I'm tenured, I do it far more loudly than I did before. I train my students to be in service of community. And if there's a research project that emerges from it, fantastic. But if there isn't a particular paper or project that emerges, what they have learned is how to enact the theories and methods in the world in the way that people need. And they often need our labor. They don't need us to come in and describe to them what a better life for them might look like. They already know that. What they need is resources, and often it's time and expertise to be able to get to that place. And I think as scholars, that is an incredible gift that we have that we can continue to give back. But we cannot even begin to engage any of that unless we're very clear about who we are and where we are and what our relationship can or will never be with the Native peoples and other groups, social, political, and minoritized groups in the communities in which we live and work.
Oh, that's wonderful. I do want to make sure that I give the audience time to ask you questions. I have plenty more that I can give you, but we'd love to open the floor to anybody that have questions for our panelists. There are microphones at the front. Anybody? Any takers? Okay.
Hi, thank you so much for your talks. I have a question, and this might be like a very basic question, but you kind of said at the beginning that we're allowed to ask those.
Yes.
So I was wondering if you could talk some about the extent to which tribal groups are subject to state laws versus federal laws versus tribal law, and especially in regards to something like marijuana that is, you know, legal or somewhat legal in some states, but at the federal level. So if you could talk to like the interplay between those different systems. Thanks.
Sure, and yeah, weed's a real good example of how this all works. So tribal land is federal land. So if something is not legal on federal land, it's then not legal in Indian country. But that doesn't mean that as sovereigns, Native nations can't enter into financial business partnerships with a whole lot of corporations and agencies and even other countries, and to be able to make decisions about commerce. They can do that. It gets sticky based on who pays the taxes where, when, and how, and then how a cut comes back to you. But because it's federal land, certain things can and cannot happen on federal land, or else it breaks federal law, and if it breaks federal law, then the federal government has to authorize it. And the federal government doesn't want to authorize particular things unless it knows exactly how it's going to govern it, but most importantly, to tax it. It's a really broad way to answer your question.
Hi, thank you so much for this talk. My name is Chelsea Stoll. I'm a third-year PhD student at Old Dominion University. I am a citizen of the Delaware Lenape Nation as well as the Cherokee Nation. I'm getting ready to begin my dissertation work that is very connected to this issue. I am hoping to do ethnographic work and possibly interviews with some of the tribes back home in Oklahoma that are implementing more traditional justice practices, whether that be peacemaking, healing to wellness courts. I'm interested in how they operationalize and how they conceptualize justice for their people. But given that, I am just curious maybe what you guys' advice would be for a scholar that is wanting to do that work. I'm not only Indigenous, I'm also white, and I didn't get to connect to my Indigenous heritage until I was an adult. And so I'm just concerned about imposing some of my own settler views that I grew up with, especially within the world of criminology on my project. So yeah, just any advice that you might have.
Yeah, that's a great question. I guess where I'll start is when I started this work, there was a lot of pushback. When I was in grad school, I went to grad school at ASU, so there was a lot of pushback from colleagues in terms of how are you going to do this work, because access to the community is an issue. But being intentional about how I did the work was really at the forefront, and so I, in grad school, took a lot of American Indian Studies courses in tandem with my criminal justice criminology courses, because I wanted to be sure to introduce those perspectives, and it was very different from criminology, and that really helped to shape how I understood. But also, as I mentioned before, having to bend to the university and making sure that my dissertation conformed to a criminological perspective needed to be there, but I also wanted to weave in things that made sense. So I think it's in tandem, making sure that you're giving acknowledgement to both literatures, I think is really important. And then I think it's also okay to bring in your own positionality and why that's important to the work that you're doing. And so I think we're always learning. And so I think that as a student, it's important to acknowledge that and just make sure that you're intentional. And then having other, myself or, who can be supportive of your work, Indigenous scholars to look at the work and to offer advice. I think that's what I tried to do, and I think that's really critical. So I don't know if you want to.
I'll add to say I'm really glad that you asked, and that you're doing this work, and that you're acknowledging the difficulties early, which helps us all to figure out how we want to navigate through any situation. What I'll add, and it's fantastic, Erica, thank you. What I'll add is that I think it's always important for me, and this is, again, how I was raised and socialized, but when I, as a Native person, enter a Native space, it's often not my own space, right? So this idea that because I'm Native, I will understand how to work with other Native people or understand the way they see the world, that's not true. Because we all have our own creation stories and ways that we understand how and why we came into the world. And we also have weird ideas, and we're socialized to think about other Native people in ways that are also problematic. Yeah. So I don't pretend to know, and I'm always very, very, very clear with my colleagues, both Native and non-Native, that because I have X identity or Y identity, that does not mean that I am the best person to be doing this project or asking this question or building this partnership. What it does mean is that I, just like everybody else, whether it's an Indian country or not, I need to ask myself really hard questions about how I'm going to show up in a space and what I intend to do there. And I mentioned this earlier, but one of the big things that always requires of me, whether it's, I'm doing work in Seattle or I'm doing work, I have a partnership with the Puyallup Nation near Tacoma, regardless of wherever I am, I'm showing up ready ready to listen, ready to work, and ready to change things up because I had a plan and it's obviously not going to happen because they either didn't read it or they did read it and they hate it and they changed their mind since last week. But this is not Indian country. This is like every community-driven partnership I've ever worked on, and so I think many people have had these experiences. So considering that our Native identity is not some kind of entry point into Indian country, because it isn't. That's like saying I understand all women because I identify as a woman. So staying humble. And for me, I always ask, what can I do to be helpful? Because I don't have questions to ask yet, and I don't expect you to give me anything, but if it would be all right if I hang around here and be helpful, maybe we might find together that our work could be meaningful and that there could be a partnership. Because maybe they don't want it. Maybe they're not sure. And so I think walking in with our eyes wide open, without any expectations of people wanting us there as scholars or even as Native people or both, it keeps us humble. And the more humility, I think, the better we are as scholars broadly.
Thank you, guys.
Hi. Ooh, sorry. This is kind of awkward, but my name is Cassie Harvey. I am also from Arizona State University. Go Sun Devils. So it's nice to know that there's somebody else out there in our alumna, or who is alumni from our school, who is focusing on Indigenous issues. So a part of my work, just a brief background about what I do, a part of my work focuses on violent victimization and homicide amongst Indigenous peoples, focusing on MMIP, particularly in Arizona. And so I was wondering, in regards to decolonizing and Indigenous methodologies, Dr. Berdahl talked about the issues with publications and maybe keeping stuff that may be more spiritual and personal, and not really producing that for like others to hear. And that kind of like speaks to the Indigenous, or like the Indigenous methods within research. I was wondering though, how at a university, at an institutional level, how we can decolonize or incorporate some of those at a university level. Like, what are some decolonizing ways that institutions can decolonize themselves, or just, you know, make changes at an institutional level to avoid, because oftentimes that is in conflict with, you know, going up for, you know, so upward mobility within, you know, your career, and you got to have those publications. So what are some things that I would like to hear more about your thoughts on ways we can decolonize institutions?
I'm just looking at you. You tell me what to do. I'm happy to go first or last. Yeah.
That's a great question. I think what comes to mind first for me is to remain steadfast in the work that you're doing, like know that it matters and it's important. And so yes, all of those things exist. Yes, all of the needing to, again, bend and fold to what the university, the academia expects of you, but doing it in a way that is authentic and that can be your own decolonizing of your work and how you show up and do that work. ASU is a really great place to do that, because there are so many resources and support and a large Indigenous population, but also at the university there's connections and programs and institutes that work directly with the tribes, and so they're really at the forefront of doing that kind of meaningful, important work. So you're in a great institution already. But that doesn't mean that there isn't a lot of work to be done, and so I think it's just remaining steadfast and knowing that maybe if like Dr. Beardahl had mentioned, maybe if you're not doing it, asking the questions, and maybe if you don't get the answer you want the first time, maybe how can we fit this in, and doing the work in the way that feels authentic to you, I think is how we decolonize the institution. Because again, we were having a conversation before coming here about the institutions just weren't designed with us in mind anyways, and especially for women of color in the academy. So there's a lot that comes with that, but I think it's having support, it's having those hard conversations and being intentional with the work that you're doing will push you forward. And so that's what I would offer.
And I feel like ditto to all of that, especially that you're doing it, and it's always heartening to see other Native folks and Native women in the academy shaking shit up. Like, I love it. And I also want to offer that because of the worlds that we walk in, we were talking about this earlier when we met, that I went to college at SF State in the College of Ethnic Studies. So my professors were all people of color who experienced the world the way that my family did and the way that I did. And so I didn't know this when I was young, but being in a space from a young age where faculty said to me and to all of us, and the expectation was that we begin from our truths, we begin from our empirics, we begin from what we know is right and just in the world, and then we move out to try to understand essentially the settler state. That has shaped me for better and for worse about how I move in the academy now. So I didn't know that it was inappropriate to require that a university or a department move in particular ways that are decolonial, or at least be able to name its coloniality. I didn't know. I thought that that was important that we have that dialogue. So the way that I do things, I don't always recommend other people do them. That's the kind of forefront. So we were talking about how we teach race and racism in sociology departments, and I start in settler colonialism. And I think that one way that the university can at least envision itself as beginning a process of decolonization, because universities themselves are meant to be the engines and epicenters of the colonial state. Let's study the people and the land so that we can survey it, and we can figure out what we need and what we don't need, and we become authorities over those things. And so if it's going to be a place of decolonization, then I think that we enact it everywhere we can. So I begin every course in settler colonialism so that people understand how and where and we are and how we all got here. But that doesn't mean I expect the university to do anything about it. They'll probably get pissed off, and that's fine. But there are things that we can do in our own space that take up space in ways that set the expectations for the people around us about how they will engage with us, how they will engage with people like us, and what their responsibilities are to us and for us to them. And then I invite my students to be in conversation with me so that I can learn the same about who they are. But I will never, watch me lie, because I don't know yet. I will never be an administrator, so I don't intend to try to help the university imagine itself that way. I think that my job is to build spaces of refuge, decolonial refuge within a system that, of course, wasn't designed to have us there. And I feel really happy in that space. But I applaud and I'm happy to be supportive, and however we can all be supportive of the things that need to happen at the institutional level.
Thank you.
Hi, Charlene.
Hello. Hi, everyone. This is really, really awesome to see. My name is Charlene Chiroti Duran. I am a citizen of the Pueblo of Acoma Nation in northern New Mexico. I'm a fifth-year PhD student at Texas A&M University. I know this panel is more thinking about more broadly and in academia, but as I listen to you guys talk, I'm thinking about some changes that have been happening in my tribal nation. So one, we just officially got, our an official Facebook page for our tribe. So we had an unofficial one, and oh my God, it's so wild. I mean, so many things on that page. But we got our official, Facebook page, and we have new leadership, and they're really trying to make, these changes of being more inclusive, getting more information. So there's been a lot of talk about our tribal police and how those officers are selected in the community. And recently there was a comment about a public forum, and it was brought up that several women had comments, but they weren't taken seriously, or they didn't feel like they were taken seriously. And so it made me think about a time when I we have a casino on my tribal nation, and I was with my aunt, and she works there, so we went there. And I remember seeing the wall, and it's all men, right? And so I made a comment. I said, oh, it's all men. I was like, we need a woman up there. And she was like, that'll never happen. And so when that happened, it got me thinking about the role of gender. So this is more specific to like tribal issues and, you know, tribal police, especially now because we're thinking about tribal police, because one of the comments was like, well, why haven't we had any women? And so thinking about gender and bringing up because also too, I think we're having more of our young people go to college, so enter academia, and then going back home and asking these questions about why aren't there women on our making tribal decisions? Why aren't there women in our policing spaces? But I think a comment too is like, that I heard was like, well, these systems have sustained us since forever, so why we're not going to change them. But we have more people or more young people coming back and saying, maybe we need this. So what are your suggestions, or have you seen this in other tribes, like where there's these questions of like gender or inclusion of different voices that have historically sustained our communities for so long?
Thank you for that question. I think what comes to mind for me is there's a broader conversation to be had about replicating patriarchy and paternalism. I think that's at the forefront of what I'm hearing in your question. And so there are actually historically a lot of indigenous tribes who were women were the leaders, women were at the forefront. And the fact that we've just over the years, because of patriarchy, because of paternalism, have gone away from that is one of the harms and the fallouts of settler colonialism. And so to try to get back to that is you need to see yourself represented to understand that you can be the thing you're trying to replicate. So having women in the police force, having women at the forefront is critical, but the how of implementing that is where the heavy lift would come in. But it would just, one little Native girl to be like, I want to be a police officer, and then if there are ride-along programs or internship programs or like something where they can more readily see themselves, I think that is how you begin to break down the who can be a police officer conversation. But more broadly, right, what comes to mind for me is that there's a broader conversation to be had about the harms of settler colonialism that impact our communities.
And I'll just add that what you're talking about, as you know, is happening all over Indian country. And it's, yes, about gender, but it's also about, like you said, our education. And are we bringing back, white people ideas, or are we bringing back our ideas? Or is this some weird hybrid that certain people are not comfortable with? Or are we bringing back the state's ideas, the federal government's ideas, because we don't need them here, or we do need them here? And it's, of course, as you know, super different. Even across all the pueblos is super different. But I think that it's also important to remember that, I come from a matrilineal people, and we don't do it very well. We say we do, so when we're like teach other people, we're like, we're matrilineal people, and we'll tell you the whole history. And then the women often that we choose in positions of power and authority, this is an identity that they embody, but the logic or expectation from tribal members about how they will behave is no different than if it was the same man who had held that position for the last 45 years. So there's a lot of contradictions. How we cut through that, I have no idea. And the Facebook pages, my goodness, it's like wild out there, the things that people say and do. And I try to think about what my one small role can be. What are some questions I can ask of other people? Not to tell them what to do, but to help them think critically about what it is we might be building or what we could be building. And to ask people often, why are you uncomfortable with that? Because that's usually how I get to the heart of an issue. Like, what makes you uncomfortable about this thing? Help me understand. And I just always pretend like I don't know, because often I don't know. And so by asking those questions, so I don't have an answer for you, but I think that asking those questions is so important for our critical awareness, both for us as individuals trying to navigate our own communities, but then also for people around us to say, well, why would she even ask that? And then they come to it often themselves.
I think we have time for one more if anybody has one, but if not, I have one. Okay, go ahead.
Anthony Peguero. Yes, you. So I'll be the first to say I'm East Coast. I learned about racialization and I learned about the idea of immigration and the theoretical concepts, assimilation, colonization, social construction and race, but it was incredibly humbling to move to the Southwest. And thinking about these concepts I've learned and thinking about that in the pursuit of racial justice, the politics of the border, the politics of all these different kinds of racial identities and processes that think about Chicano and Latinx or Latino, and how do you negotiate those things, you know, and especially coming out to ASU, understanding the idea of transborder. How do you think about even this title and the relationship with it intersecting with these different identities as scholars and researchers interacting with institutions that have been, you're trying to either reform or consult or advise where their knowledge, and I appreciate you saying these things, of how they think about race or how they think about what Indigenous is, or what they think, depending on where you are, what they think Tejano is, and all these different identities. Like, how do you navigate that? Is that simply contextualized, or is this, as a researcher, something that you are committed to a particular way and then you just try to inform? Does that make sense what I'm asking?
How do we negotiate different
Yeah.
kinds of borders in
Yes.
different kinds of places to be able to get at the heart of the work that perhaps the title might capture or not capture?
Correct.
Okay. Big question.
Yeah, you can, go ahead.
So I don't know how to answer the question, but I will say that it is, I think, the Southwest does a really good job of humbling a lot of people, especially if you're not from there, because it requires you to be accountable and knowledgeable by name of peoples generally. For those of us who grew up in the Southwest, we were expected to know the differences and to not mix people up. There was no, at least for me, there was no broad category of like, these are Hispanic people. I would never have been allowed to say that growing up in San Diego and in LA, and I still can't say. I need to know who's Salvadorian, and I need to know who's Venezuelan, and I need to know, are they first or second generation? There's a whole lot of relationality happening. So it takes decades to be socialized into doing it, but I think that it is a humbling thing because it means I show up in a place and I don't know the answers. I have a sense of who I am, but I have a sense of who I am on my own terms. I don't know how you're going to receive me or not receive me. I make perfect sense in Southern California. Being Mexican and Native and having white skin somewhere else in the country, they're like, so is this just the rarest thing I've ever heard? I was like, no, there's like 200, 300,000 people just like me in this one little place. It is not an anomaly. So I don't know the answer, but I do know that humility helps all of us. And being willing to understand that the way we think we show up in the world is not how other people see us showing up in the world. And that my responsibility is to ask a lot of questions and to do my best to remember the correct answers as they have stated them, and to also understand people change their mind all the time because politics change, because laws change, because the way we talk about street race changes, all of this stuff changes. And money comes in and comes out and changes the standing and hierarchies of people all the time. So I don't know how we do it, but welcome to the conversation because it is very different where you are now based on being in the East Coast and New York in particular.
Again, that was great. I think the only thing that I'll add too is that when we think about that in the context of Indigenous people, it's also very convoluted because in, you know, having a conversation with my husband before we got here, he was like, I don't really like the word Indigenous. So it really depends on who you're talking to, and really at the core, this is how you exist in the academy. Indigenous people should be referred to by their own tribal name. So my husband is Numa Niwi, but saying that, would somebody be like, what would you just say? So, you know, Paiute and Shoshone are the colonial names that were given to them. And then more broadly, when we think about race and justice issues, it's you need to say American Indian or Native American or whatever the umbrella term is to describe this particular people. But even within that, there are over 500 federally recognized tribes that all have their own language and names that they prefer to be called by. So it's convoluted, it's difficult conversation, but yeah, we're doing it and decolonizing in making space for that conversation.
And there's a lot of code switching happening, not just for you, but for the rest of us too at the same time. I don't use the term Indigenous peoples unless I'm talking to academics, because they're like, oh, those people. And it's like, okay, but I would never say that to another Native person. I would need to know of which tribes they come from, because it's very rare that we are only of one people. And so the terms we use, how we use them, especially when you're in mixed company, it changes. And it's important to be flexible about how we communicate who we are and how we listen to how other people show up in the world. Because the way that we also think about criminality, the way that we think about our responsibilities to each other within our own nations is not synonymous across Indian country at all. So even the title assumes there's some sharedness here, and the sharedness may be that we experience settler colonialism in particular ways that non-Native people don't, but we're far more different from each other than we are similar sometimes.
Thank you both for this and starting this important conversation about all the nuances and complexities that we all need to continue to grapple with, and so many of the questions that lie ahead. People are messy. We're always going to have jobs, y'all. That's the thing to remember. People are very messy. But thank you. On behalf of the American Society of Criminology, thank you, Erica and Teresa, for having this conversation with us, sharing your insights and your courage and your commitment. And thank you all for joining in this important panel and starting this important conversation here, and that truly reckons with its colonial inheritance and moves us towards something hopefully more just in the future, and especially more human. So thank you all. Bye.